Hi there. I realise I'm actually early. I'm often early to things, but I'm just sort of settling in and just checking if people are out there, if you can hear me. It's always a sort of nerve-wracking moment when you start one of these things, and you just don't know if you're talking to yourself. In all honesty, hurrah! Lovely Anne Bennett, no idea who she is, but she's obviously lovely because she's responded to me and she sent me a little note going, hello. So I'm assuming, Anne, you can hear me. Send me another one saying yes. Hello. Emma was also saying she can hear me, which is excellent. I do know who Emma is, so that's good. Well, I shall just pause for a moment, give it a second. People are arriving. I've got a new top on. I've blow dried my hair. It's all feeling rather marvellous. This is getting exciting because we are now getting the little notes of where people are from. I always find that so extraordinary. There's a lot of things about lockdown that's annoying all of us, let's be honest. But one of the tremendous things that's actually opened some doors is the fact I'm doing a lot more of this kind of events, and so many authors are. And it's brilliant because we're reaching readers all over not only the country, but the world. And that's amazing. So, yes. Oh, and we're getting a lot of love for the top. Yes. I'm quite pleased with it myself, actually. Um, yeah, I've been doing far too much online shopping. The only online shopping that is justified right now, guys, is books. Can I tell you? The whole buying of outfits, probably not justified. I got away with this one because I knew I did have tonight's event. But yeah, I think we're all doing it a bit. Got to treat yourself nicely at the moment. Yay! And I'm getting some familiar names now and familiar faces. And we are officially on 8 o'clock. So I can go into full Adele mode because we know that you're listening, you're here. It usually takes people a few minutes to settle in and catch up because, there's the kids to put to bed and the wine to pour if you've been doing the homeschooling. I mean, I'm not doing homeschooling. My child is 19, and so way beyond that, praise be. That's my Margaret Atwood reference, in case you think I'm just having a religious moment. I quite often do also say under his eye. Okay, I'm waffling. So it's brilliant to be here tonight. I'm here with At Home. You know that because you're at home with Four Indies. You know that because you're on their site. If you've come to this event via me rather than At Home with Four Indies, do look on their site because they've had a tremendous amount of really exciting, fun authors talking to them recently. And, as a book lover, it's a great resource. And largely, one of the reasons they've had lots of people talking to them, lots of authors talking to them at the moment, is they're working with the Nibbies, which, for those of you who don't know, are sort of the book industry Oscars. Now, that might sound very grand, but it's what we've got, okay? It's not in LA, but there is kind of a red carpet, or most years, not this year, and long frocks and such. And it's a hugely exciting event where all sorts of different parts of the industry are celebrated, whether that's booksellers in independent bookshops or some of the chains, or librarians, editors, authors, publishing houses. It's an extraordinary evening, and I'm very excited about it, particularly this year, because my novel Lies, Lies, Lies has been nominated as shortlisted as one of the potential books of the year for 2019. So that's extraordinary. Very, very exciting indeed. And all the other nominees, I think, are going to be talking, or many of them are going to be talking on At Home for Books. So yeah, check out the site. Okay, so I have a lovely long list of questions. I mean, if you've ever heard me talk before, you know I don't really dry up. And if anything, I overrun. Sorry, I'm apologising in advance. But to keep me on script and to keep me sort of, on the straight and narrow, I do have some questions in front of me that have been kindly provided. So the first one is, I've been asked to give you a little bit of an idea of my journey as a writer. Okay, so I've published 20 best-selling novels in 20 years, which is remarkable for a 25-year-old, isn't it? No, I'm 51. And how did I come to that? And how did that come about? Well, I always wanted to be a writer from being a small child, and that was thanks to a librarian who suggested it to me when I was only 5, 6 year old. She noticed that me and my mum and my sister visited very, very regularly and pointed that out to me. And in that way, adults do, that they try and suggest to children things they might like to do with their lives. She said, "Oh, do you think you might become an author one day?" And actually, I was so young, I found it quite mortifying when she asked me this, because I didn't understand the word author. And I had to say, "Oh, what does that mean?" And I don't know what that means. And she said to me, "Hang on a moment." And she rushed off to the children's section, my section, and came back with an Enid Blyton book. And if you are about my age, you will, or even I think now the books are still produced in the same way, you'll see that Enid Blyton kind of signs her name on the front of the book. I mean, clearly she doesn't. It's the way the publishers manage it. But it looked amazing. And the librarian at the time said to me, "You see, there's this lady called Enid Blyton, and she sits at home writing these books for you." And for many years, I actually thought Enid Blyton literally was writing for me. Excellent. Slightly inflated sense of self, possibly, but that's children for you. But secondly, it was the first time I connected the physical book and story in my hands with a person who made their stories up. And the moment I did that, it was absolutely what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a writer. I'm from the northeast of England, terrific place to be from. But I come from a family that had no publishing connections whatsoever. In fact, until I actually met my agent, I had never met anybody in the publishing world. I hadn't met a single author or editor or agent. And that would be different nowadays, because of events such as these, authors are much more accessible, and because of social media, we're much more accessible. And I think now, if you want to be a published writer, the path is sort of out there and discussed by a lot of people, but it wasn't then. And certainly not for me, living in the northeast of England with a dad who was an engineer and a mum who had the kind of jobs that sort of worked around the children. So I didn't really have a clear path. I didn't really know how to be a writer. I went to university. I was the one of the first generation to go to university in my family, which was incredibly exciting. And I went to Leicester and read English language and literature. And I always think I kept my ambition to be a writer an absolute secret. I thought it was kind of this incredibly personal, very difficult to talk about thing, because how do you know if you're good enough or if you've any talent at all? And isn't it just really vain to talk about wanting to be a writer and assuming somebody might want to read your stuff? So I always believed that. But actually, funny story, because when I eventually did get published, nearly to the last woman standing, all my friends turned around and said, "Oh, thank goodness," because every time you get drunk, that's all you talk about, the fact you're going to be a writer. So it turns out not such a secret at all, because throughout my sort of drunken student years, I talked about it a lot. I didn't just talk about it. I read vociferously, obviously for my course, but also for pleasure. It is still my greatest pleasure, reading, and I hope I hope it counts amongst yours too. And I also constantly wrote. I had a notebook with me wherever I went, and I called those my scribblings, really. Anyway, I left university. There was not a clear path of how to become a writer. I actually had no idea at all, other than the fact that my favourite writer at the time, which was Ian Foster, had gone to Italy and as a young man, and written things like Where Angels Fear to Tread and Room with a View, and they were some of my favourite books. And I remember thinking, okay, I'll go to Italy and something tremendous will happen to me, and that'll be brilliant, and I'll come home and write about it, and somebody's bound to offer me a publishing contract. I cannot tell you how naive every single thought in that process is, but that's one of the joys of being 21. You almost don't know what you don't know, and that's what's superb about being 21, because you can just go for it. So I went to Italy full of this sort of excitement and ambition, and waiting for this amazing thing to happen to me that would allow me to become this writer. And indeed, an amazing thing did happen to me in Italy. I came home with sort of double my body weight. I mean, the pasta is fabulous, the food is phenomenal, but not really much for me to write about. It didn't happen. And by then, my parents were getting a little bit tense with me at the idea that I had gone to university, and as I say, first generation university, so they were expecting something to happen with this degree, and the fact that I seemed to be flitting around, putting on weight and reading books was not enough. So I moved to London, and I actually started, well, I did loads of jobs and eventually started working in advertising. And it went really well for me. I was incredibly happy in that role. I worked for some great advertising agencies, Bottle, Bogle and Hegarty and TBWA. I spent some time in Botswana helping set up an advertising agency out there. Amazing experience, especially I was a 25-year-old, just mind-blowing actually. And I then came home and worked in the UK for a management consultancy company, Accenture, but not as a management consultant, but working in their advertising department and looking after the advertising for Europe, Middle East, Africa and India. So it was all going extremely well. And because it was all going extremely well, whilst I was still reading and writing, that ambition had sort of kind of trailed off a little bit, actually. It wasn't that it had gone away. I just think I started listening to the people around me that frequently told me it wouldn't happen, and that it was a bit pie in the sky, and I had a great job that earned decent money, and you know, I ought to concentrate on that, and that all made perfect sense. However, and my story is sounding pretty dreamy until about now, so prepare yourselves for the sad bit. In my late 20s, I lost a number of friends and family members in quite quick succession. And some of those people were older than me, a lot older than me, and therefore you might expect it. Doesn't mean it's any less traumatic and difficult, but some of them were not older than me, and some of them were under very, very difficult circumstances indeed. It's too grim to go into right now on this lovely evening, but it was a number of people in a short time, over a period of 11 months, and I lost my footing, I think, a little bit in the world. I became quite scared of the world and didn't think it was a safe or glorious place to be, which I think actually is quite interesting, because at the moment I think there's a lot of people thinking that about the world, and yet this story has an arc and things are going to get better. So I went to a grief counsellor actually, and explained that I didn't trust the world. I wasn't very happy. I couldn't imagine being happy again. All these deaths had definitely affected me. And she said, look, you need to take control of your own happiness. You need to find something small that you can always do, that you are in control of, that makes you happy. Be that a bit of gardening or listening to a piece of music or reading a book, which actually, by the way, is tremendously good advice that I've gone back to in life time and time again. And she said to me, what is the one thing that you control that's not dependent on anybody else? You control it and it makes you happy. And eventually I said, well, actually, I do this thing, I scribble. And she said to me, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, I used to think I wanted to be a writer. Well, I do want to be a writer. And I sort of said it aloud for the first time for many years. I do want to be a writer. And I do this scribbling, and it always makes me feel calmer, and it always makes me feel more organised, more in control. I process things that way. And so she said to me, you should go home and do a little bit more of that. And I am quite a girly swat, so I didn't hear do a little bit more of that. I heard go home and finally write that novel. So I was about 28 at that point. Very long answer to this first question. I bet you're thinking, I hope she speeds up for the others, but actually I'm covering off some of them as we speak. So I was about 28 at that point. I still kept the day job. I worked at Accenture, long hours, and I mentioned it was quite a big area that I looked after. So I was often on aeroplanes and in hotel rooms, and so I started writing a novel that was huge escapism, actually, from the grief and sadness I was feeling. A lot of people with their first novel tend to write something quite autobiographical, and there's literally nothing wrong with that. Of course there isn't. People say, write what you know. But I wanted to write something quite different from my world, actually. So I wrote the novel that eventually became Playing Away, not about football. And I wrote it 3 hours a week, 2 or 3 times a week, and 5 hours at a weekend. A quite strict timetable that did mean I had to sacrifice other things. And in my late 20s, this is what I sacrificed. I sacrificed ironing clothes. Nobody cares. That's never been an issue for me. I sacrificed watching Coronation Street. Bit of an issue for me, I'll be honest. That was a harder one. But I have occasionally dipped back in Coronation Street sort of once every 10 years. And I'm okay. I can catch up with it. It's fine. And I also sacrificed going out with my friends quite a lot, actually, because that's what you do a lot in your late 20s. You do if you're not in lockdown. And so those things didn't happen, but it was worth it because I did write Playing Away, and it actually got to a stage where it could be submitted. And I mentioned I had no idea about anyone, didn't know anyone in publishing, didn't know how to approach this at all. So I got a great big fat book called The Writer's and Artist's Handbook, which is still an enormous tool now. If you want to be a writer, get that book. And that book is a listing of all the agents and publishing houses in the UK and sort of how they like their submissions and what kind of books submissions they're interested in and that sort of thing. And I just old school combed through it and identified somebody that I was going to approach. And I think that's quite interesting that basically a book led me to becoming a novelist, because it is just always my go-to. You know, when I had my son only a year after that, the very first thing I did was buy lots of books on how to be a parent, because if I need to put up a shelf, I will buy a book on how to put up a shelf. That is just the way I operate. Anyway, on the eve of my 30th birthday, because I like a deadline, I took my first 3 chapters of my manuscript round to an agent I had identified in Curtis Bryan. His name's Johnny Geller, and I'd identified him in The Writer's and Artist's Handbook, and I took it with the most weird submission, I think, actually. People normally take a sort of paragraph about who you are, what's your other writing experience, that sort of thing, but I didn't really have any other writing experience. I did have an idea who the book was targeted at, and so I wrote a 10-word pitch, an elevator pitch, and that elevator pitch went like this. I said, Anna Karenina meets Bridget Jones, but heroine gets to live. 10 words flat. And it was a gamble. I guess because I had an advertising background, I decided I could take that gamble. But what I was doing there was clearly not trying to say I was Tolstoy, but identifying what we all know about Anna Karenina. Spoiler if you haven't read it, she has an affair. And spoiler again, if you haven't read it, she dies. And in my book, I was saying, actually, I'm writing a book about a person having an affair, but it's much more in the Bridget Jones genre and the Helen Fielding genre, which was enormous at the time and indeed still is. And so I kind of swiftly identified who I was writing for and what kind of book I was writing. And I left it on the desk of this Johnny Geller, who I didn't know from Adam, and went back to the Northeast to celebrate my birthday with my family. And when I came home on the Sunday evening, my answering machine's light was flashing, and there was a message from Johnny saying, I like this, I'd like to talk, I think we could do something with this. And so there I was, 30-year-old, literally the day of my, 2 days after my 30th birthday it was by this point, and the dream of the little girl on the library, or the chubby kid that went to Italy and tried to follow in Ian Foster's footsteps, or the person who'd carried a notebook around scribbling for 25 of those 30 years had finally come true. And I promise you, I played that message on the answering machine about 50 times. I mean, quite obsessively, I have to say. So it was a dream come true, and it was lovely, and has been lovely ever since. That book actually was taken to 6 publishing houses, and by one of those miracles that sometimes happen, which is why we're all in this game, because sometimes miracles happen. All 6 publishing houses accepted the manuscript and showed interest in the manuscript. So then there was a bidding war, and that was marvellous, because that meant within a few months I could give up my day job and become a full-time writer, which might be a really sickening story for many of you if you are currently trying to be a novelist, and perhaps you've sent many manuscripts off and you've had many rejections. And if that story is sickening, remember J.K. Rowling's story, because she's fine. You know, it all worked out good for her too. There are many ways to approach this. So hope that's enlightening for you. I'm now going to have a quick look at my list to see where we are on, because I've realised I have covered off some of the things like sort of what books influenced you, because obviously the fact that I was reading as a child was incredibly important and did influence me, and the fact that I could identify my market when I did write Playing Away was quite interesting too, because I could say, oh, it's in the Helen Fielding genre. Although Helen Fielding had written about women who were single and looking for a partner, and my book obviously starts with her being married, and she's looking for another partner. Obviously, the clue's in the name, Playing Away, not about football. So, but I was able to identify my market that way. And so, yeah, it's gone from strength to strength from that. I have over the years very much changed my writing style, and I have visited different genres. For about 7 or 8 books, I think I wrote romantic comedy, with always a dark edge and a dark twist, and usually a sort of rug pull or a reveal at the end. That's always been my thing. And that, I think, and also tricky heroines. I like a tricky heroine. Never underestimate a tricky heroine. So yeah, I did that for several years, and then my work started to sort of evolve in a different direction. I think I became less interested in writing about relationships, or sort of romantic relationships, and I became more interested in sort of dilemmas that people face in their lives. I suspect it was just as I grew up, as I got older, because when you're very young, you look outwards at the choices you have ahead of you. And certainly as an author, I wrote about the choices my characters had. And then as time went on, as my writing changed, and I looked more often at the consequences of the characters' actions, and I looked back. And I often picked a sort of dilemma, whether that was sort of like an illness, maybe Alzheimer's or alcoholism, or maybe I would look at being divorced or infertility or infidelity, and use more of a theme really than being sort of in a genre of romantic comedy. However, and this isn't actually on my questions, but it does crop up, so I might as well address it. As the years went on, I realised that it was quite hard to be taken sort of seriously if you've started your career writing romantic comedy. The whole point of romance and comedy is it's uplifting, and that doesn't mean it's light or frivolous or unimportant. It's actually incredibly important, and anybody reading an uplifting book right now will know how important escapism is. And actually writing comedy is significantly more difficult in many ways than writing a level of tragedy. But I found it tricky to sort of shake that off. So I looked at a completely different genre for a while, and I wrote 2 historical novels that were set in World War I and just after World War I. One about a conscientious objector, that's called If You Go Away, and the other about the women who were seen as surplus after the war, the women of marrying age. There was 1 million of them, according to the census, just after World War I, who ought to have been married and couldn't be because there wasn't enough men to go around. And what happened to them? Well, actually, feminism happened to them, and it's great. It's another one of those complete horrific tragedies that somehow has a silver lining. But that is what I wrote about. And by writing in a completely different genre and just shaking things up, I think I showed myself, my readers, and indeed the industry, booksellers and librarians and editors, everybody, that I was prepared to sort of take risks and hopefully take my readers along with me, because I hope that I still always had the same sort of tell it as it is, truthful, sort of spiky style that I hope you enjoy reading. And so I started writing what we now are identifying as a genre called domestic noir, which is sort of psychological thrillers but set in the home. And for me, what's most exciting about domestic noir is I can really investigate some pretty dark parts of my brain, let's face it. Generally speaking, I'm a pretty chirrupy human being. I'm very optimistic and I like to look on the bright side of life, and I'm definitely glass half full. However, there is something incredibly exciting and even, I would say, fulfilling, definitely challenging about looking at the deeper, darker, more morbid sides to human nature. And so I started writing books about ordinary families in ordinary situations. Ordinary families in extraordinary situations. They set off quite ordinary, and then something happens to them, and it's a catalyst to see people showing their true colours. Because I do believe that we all care about our family and our friends more than anything, and therefore, if the risk is that close to home, you are likely to show your own colours. And I did that for several years, and I wrote sort of The Image of You, and I invited her in. And then I wrote this book, Lies, 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 which is the one I mentioned right at the beginning of this talk, is the book that I published last year in 2019, and it is the book that is currently on the shortlist for the Nibby's Award of Book of the Year, which is ridiculously exciting. So what is this book about? That after 19 years of writing novels, and novels that did get attention, what made this one different? Well, what made it different for me is it got the #1 slot, which, can I tell you, was phenomenal. For many, many years, I had been lucky enough to be in the top numbers in the bestseller list, but I hadn't hit that #1 spot. So I'd got to the point, you know how you do, where you tell yourself it's not meant to be, and it doesn't matter, and it's just a number, and aren't I lucky anyhow, because I've got gorgeous readers and fans and a contract, and I'm writing, and that is actually the most important thing. And who needs it anyway? And then I got that #1 slot, and it turns out I needed it anyway. It was the most exciting, phenomenal, fantastic moment. And so I would like to take a breath to say thank you to every single person who ever bought that book, every single bookseller who sold that book, and every single reviewer and blogger who recommended that book on, because I couldn't have done it without you, and I am so grateful. What's the book about? So it's about this couple, Daisy and Simon, who have known each other 15 years and been together 15 years. And it's always awkward when I say this, because I've been with my husband for 16 years. We've been married 16 years. So if I say this, he takes it personally, but he shouldn't. But I was going to say, because they're married 15 years, they are past that first fling, lusty stage at the beginning, and they're settled in a relationship. They've gone through some dark times together, some difficult times together, but they've come through it. The two biggest challenges they've faced is, one, that it took them a decade to finally start a family, and we meet them when their one and only child, their little girl, is about 5, and the other consequence of waiting for 10 years to have that baby and having to go through endless fertility treatments that are very grueling. If you know anybody who's been through them, or if you've been through them yourself, you will know that they are demoralizing and difficult and frightening and very often hard work on a couple. And Simon has started to drink heavily. Simon, the man in the couple, he started to drink heavily, and he is what we would probably identify as a functioning alcoholic. Anyway, he thinks his daughter is perfect. Don't we all think our kids are perfect? And they all are. But he thinks his daughter's perfect, and he wants to give her everything. And in his everything, he also thinks he would love to give her another sibling. And so he starts campaigning to Daisy, let's try again, let's have another baby. And Daisy is not having it. She's exhausted. She has been through endless rounds of IVF and all sorts of other treatments. And their baby actually happened after they'd given up on clinical treatments, as sometimes miracle babies do. When you finally think, I'd say to have had enough, I'm not even going to try anymore. Some people are lucky enough to fall pregnant. And that's what had happened to Daisy and Simon. So this has given Simon hope, and he keeps saying, let's just give it one more shot. And she's thinking, no, first of all, it was grueling the first time around, and secondly, you're drinking too much and you're almost a baby yourself, and I'm already looking after you, which she isn't articulating, but she is thinking. The book's told from alternative chapters from each one of those points of view, and I think you'll find you flip between sympathising with one or the other of them. Simon decides to push ahead. This is not too much of a spoiler, by the way. This is all like chapter 1. I'm not ruining anything. Simon decides to push ahead. He takes himself off to the best fertility doctor in the country that he can possibly find, and he decides he'll start going through some tests. He'll ask if there's been any improvements in treatments, and perhaps see if he can persuade Daisy to re-look at the situation. But actually, all he finds out is that absolutely categorically he cannot have another baby. That won't be happening. And more than that, he never has. He's never been a biological father. It's technically impossible because of his tests show that it's technically impossible. Clearly, as a functioning alcoholic, news like that means you function ever so slightly less. And they spiral. They spiral as a couple. I promise you, this really is early days in this book. That is lie number 1. It says lies, lies, lies. There are 3 of them. There are actually gazillions of them. And so it's got lots of twists. It's got lots of turns. It's very plot dependent, and yet I hope you will believe in the characters, and I hope you'll feel for the characters and go on their journey with them. So I think that book caught fire because I look at some things that some of us have gone through and some of us are aware of. Probably many of us know somebody, especially right now in lockdown, probably many of us know somebody who's drinking just a little bit too much. And there's a borderline, isn't there, thinking that's quite jolly and he's quite fun with that, to actually that's destructive and that's going to cause our family problems. And these couple do sort of start tearing the thing that matters to them both most in the world, which is their family unit, their child. They actually start tearing that down and destroying it. So let's see what you make of it if you get a chance to pick that book up. That is one of my books right now. The other one of my books, the book that came out during lockdown, there's a story in itself, is called Just My Luck. I'm trying to show you the title. It's a pretty glossy title, so it refracts and reflects on the screen. But Just My Luck is a story about a couple that win the lottery. So very, very different indeed. But similar to Lies, 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 it's not all that it seems. You think winning the lottery is the answer to all your dreams. I certainly thought that when I started writing it, but then as I moved on into my research, I realised that it might very well be a nightmare. And during lockdown, we did launch Just My Luck, and that has actually just reached #1 position in the charts too, which is joyful. And it turns out I only have 1 child, and I don't know that feeling of having a second fabulous child, but apparently I am now getting a tiny understanding of that, because I now feel that both of my babies have had that #1 spot, which is amazing and wonderful. Which brings me to the next question, which I found quite embarrassing, this question actually. It says, you are described as one of the biggest selling women's fiction writers in the UK, and how does that make you feel? Well, I am described as that because, the numbers just stack up. if you write 20 books and they all sell quite well, eventually you will become one of the biggest women's fiction writers in the UK, which is, you know, exciting and astonishing. And as somebody who I am an ambitious person, so that is a lovely thing for me to hear. But I think the most important thing to me as a writer has always been that I am writing. And I think the most exciting thing for me is that I've been given the opportunity that over 20 years to be allowed to keep writing, that somebody is kind enough to pay me to do that, and somebody else, many people are kind enough to give their hard-earned cash, and probably more importantly their hours of their time, to read what I have written. And that's the joy, actually, and that's the thing that excites me, probably much more than hearing, oh, you know, this is where you are in the ranking or whatever. Because actually it's also really hard to tell, because whilst I mentioned when I started out I hardly knew, well, I didn't know anybody in publishing, and I didn't know a single writer or editor or agent, nearly everyone I know now is, not surprisingly, a writer or an editor or an agent or somebody in publishing, and or bookseller, you know, somebody in the industry. And I know so many phenomenal writers, and I read their work all the time, and so I don't think you can say one is better than the other. I think that's the glorious thing about being a writer. When somebody reads a good book and they finish it, they don't give up reading. The very next thing they want to do is look for another good book. So you know, so we're all in this together, and we're actually very supportive of one another. The sort of, I have many contemporaries that are very supportive. I have been asked to name some of my favourite authors and books, and I loathe doing this because I always find after I've done it, I think, oh, and then there's so-and-so who I adore and I love their books and I should be reading, I should have mentioned them. But I will mention some of my stalwarts that I think are phenomenal and I've been reading for many years. I read Lisa Jewell, and I always have, and she also, hands in her, she's a friend of mine. I read an Australian writer called Sally Hepworth. I love Nicola Moriarty, another Australian writer. Claire McIntosh's book, well, many of her books are fabulous, but last year's book, After the End, broke my heart and then fixed it again. There's some debut writers that I adore. Lewin Goldie is terrific. Louise Hare is amazing. So there are a number of authors out there, and honestly, I have scratched the surface. I read a book about once a week, one book a week. So by me mentioning 5 or 6 authors, I am literally scratching the surface. Rosamund Lupman, 3 Hours, I think it's called, that her latest, amazing. So yes, yeah, I'm not going to be, you know, I just don't know how to answer that question because there are so many great authors. And I think that's what's exciting about working with indie bookshops, because I swear to you, if you go into Lingham's or Bookish or Booker or Forum, if you go into any one of them, or indeed any of your local independent bookshops, you will find somebody who will say to you, oh, you enjoyed this, therefore you might enjoy this, and will recommend books onto you. And isn't that just always the best way, if somebody recommends a book onto you? It just makes you want to read them. Kate Atkinson, you see, names are coming to me all the time, and I'm thinking, why didn't I say her name? But yes, I could just keep going. I've also been asked here, I've written 20 books in 20 years. I write lots of short stories and articles for magazines and newspapers, and I do lots of promoing when I have a new book out, etc. And so I was asked, you know, how do I fit it all in? And the answer is, I'm really glad I had my training as a management consultant at Accenture, because they really teach you how to be disciplined and organized and work hard. And I think people forget that being a novelist isn't just about waiting for the muse to arrive and for you to have that inspirational moment. I mean, that is important, that you have an idea, of course, but I think the idea is a tiny part of the process. And after that, there's an infinite amount of sort of planning and prep and research, and I will talk about some of that. But there's a huge amount of that. And then there is the writing, which is day in, day out, day in, day out. And I'm glad writing is day in, day out. I love it. It's a joy. I think it's wonderful for me to be able to escape to my desk and escape into my world that I can create where people behave themselves or don't behave themselves, but at least I'm in control. And I love it. But yeah, it's a lot of discipline and it's a lot of organization. But it's not, I'm never going to complain about it. I'm never going to say it's anything other than, I mean, even when it sometimes is quite a nightmare, because some days are harder than others and you might lose your confidence, you might lose your way, but I'm never going to say it's anything other than the dream job, because it really was my dream come true, and it is my dream come true. And so I think that one of the reasons I've been able to produce 20 books in 20 years and all those articles and short stories and things is because I love it. And if you're doing something you love, my dad said this to me once when I was a little girl. He said, if you can change your hobby into your job, you'll never work a day in your life. And whilst I have definitely worked lots of days in my life, I kind of know what he means. It doesn't really feel that arduous at all. I've been asked here as well about my interest in the National Literacy Trust, which is a charity I am an ambassador for. It's a charity that's entirely devoted to igniting that spark in children that makes them excited about reading and helping them to get, helping the children in Great Britain to get on an equal playing field by being able to read as well as their contemporaries. Because in Britain, the truth is there is a divide between people and children, on, you know, could be where they are born or what kind of income they're born into, or just the opportunities that they're given. And one of the very simple opportunities that we can give all our children is the gift of reading, because reading empowers, it obviously entertains, but it empowers and it educates and it opens doors. And that's what the National Literacy Trust do. They work with kids from tiny babies, premature babies are read to by their mums to start a kind of connection right the way through to teenagers who are just beginning to think books are boring, and we try and bring them back in and explain, kind of give them that love again. And it's a great charity to be involved in. It has meant I've done really strange things, like sort of what do you call it when you sort of, I was on a rope and I came down a building. I've forgotten the word. Anyway, you know, when you sort of gosh, there I go. There's my age. But I have flung myself off sort of very tall buildings in sponsorship moments, mud sponsorship moments, and I work particularly in Teesside. I'm an ambassador in Middlesbrough because that's the area I come from, and sadly the literacy levels in Middlesbrough are not as good as the rest of the country. And now that's been identified, I would like to be part of fixing that problem. And yeah, it's a great charity, and do go and check out their website. And also on a very macro level, if you know a child that you want to show your love to, buy them a book. There is no better way of showing anybody how much you love them than gifting them a story, gifting them escape and imagination. I mean, now more than ever, isn't that just wonderful that when we can't go on long journeys and we can't easily get on aeroplanes and visit other countries, we can just pick up a book and be there in a second, but from the safety and comfort of our couch. So it's just a thought. Okay, I have flashed around a little on these questions. Well, yes, I really have. Okay, here's a question, because I've just been talking about lockdown. I've been asked here, do I think lockdown will lead to a whole host of different kind of domestic noir scenarios? I would say it's possible, very possible. I don't know when that will be. because the way the publishing world works, I'm currently writing a book now that will be published next year. Um, some people might think they want to write this through now. Others might think they want to wait 2 or 3 years before they process how they've felt now. But I would say that most people that are, in my genre, in domestic noir or thrillers, have, we have certain tropes that are quite useful. And one of them is extraordinary circumstances, and lockdown is that. Obviously, your characters becoming isolated in some way is often quite useful, and lockdown offers that. So I think there might be a number of stories. Certainly, in my case, I would probably find that it's a background. I don't think it would be the center of one of my stories yet. I don't feel ready. Or I also think we might just want to be done with it. By the time we are able to spread our wings freely again at some point, we might not want to read about this period of our lives straight away, but it might be something we want to read about in a couple of years, and we might find it interesting. Who knows? I'm a judge of the Costa the Costa Award, but I do the short story, which is a really interesting prize, actually. Anybody can put in a short story, whether you're published or unpublished, and they come to us completely anonymously. We don't know the age or gender or anything about the person who has written the short story. And I suspect, because that's happening now, that competition is live now, and I will start, me and my fellow judges, who are all adorable, we will all start judging in about October. So I suspect there will be a number of short stories that will talk about lockdown, because short stories tend to, you tend to be processing something quite urgent and quite now. So I'll be interested to see where that pans out. Okay, and I have been asked, your books take people's desires and aspirations and show what can happen when things don't go to plan. Why am I so fascinated by the dark side of human nature? Well, I did sort of touch on this a little bit, but to give it a bit more breath, particularly in this book, Just My Luck, I mentioned that this couple, Lexi and Jake, are they're in a friendship group, and there are 3 couples that are super close, and they have been close for 15 years, and that friendship is very meaningful to all of them. But I think particularly to Lexi, who is my heroine. Again, it's a novel that's written from multiple viewpoints. I love doing that because I think it exposes us and our frailties so effectively, because we can only see things from our own points of view, even though we shouldn't, and even though we should try and be more empathetic. So having more than one viewpoint, more than one character narrating, is always quite exciting for me. But Lexi and her daughter narrate this novel, Just My Luck, largely. Other people do too, but largely it's those two. And these 3 couples have always been in a syndicate, and they buy a lottery ticket together. But unfortunately, one weekend, they have like a little tiff, the way family friends that are very, very close can. Something just is said and it's a bit off, and then it gets out of hand. And then that little tiff goes into a huge rift, and people start saying things they regret, and there's a huge fallout. And 2 of the couples walk away from the syndicate. And Lexi and her husband, Jake, continue to buy the ticket with the same 6 numbers that they chose as a group, actually, and the same 6 numbers they've been using for 15 years. And very shortly after the rift, the winning numbers come up, and Lexi and Jake win almost £18 million, which I think we'll all agree is a life-changing sum of money. It was good fun, this novel, to research and dream. And I found myself sort of going into shops and thinking, what if you were stupidly wealthy? What do you spend your money on? Turns out I'm not going to be very good at being stupidly wealthy if it ever does happen to me, because I would come out of shops on Bond Street and say things like, £900 for a t-shirt, £900, I wouldn't, not over my dead body. And I just wouldn't, it isn't for me. And actually, that's what's interesting about Lexi and Jake in Just My Luck. They have very different views on how they should spend the money. And more importantly still, these friendships that have been incredibly important to them are now deeply tested, because of course the two couples that dropped out of the syndicate feel a moral, if not legal, right to this money, and they absolutely want a share of it, and they will go to some very dark and dirty lengths to get their share of it. I think I mentioned that I quite like investigating parts of my brain that in day-to-day civilized society I keep in check, because why wouldn't I? But it is interesting and fun to write characters that go places I wouldn't like to in real life. And also, I think what's interesting is more often than not, they get the just desserts in my novels, and unfortunately, in real life, that doesn't happen. And so I think there's something quite lovely for me that appeals to my sense of order, that I can take them to dark places, and I can also look at the fact that nobody is purely good, and nearly every good person still has done some bad things, and some very dreadful, terrible people occasionally have a glimmer of light too. And it is the fact that we are this spectrum and this shade of humanity, this sort of range of emotions and ability to act. It is the fascinating thing as a novelist that I like to investigate over and over. Writing tips. My final segment, which is really nicely timed because we've got about 11 minutes left. I might run over, I'll try not to. Because you're all ready for your glass of wine now, aren't you? It's that time of night, just saying. Unless you're watching this later on tomorrow morning, and then you probably shouldn't be having your glass of wine, just saying. Not judging, just saying. So I've been asked, what would my top tips be for creating characters that readers can relate to? I think this one's really specifically interesting for me. I try very hard to write characters that can exist. You might not like them all. You won't like them all. I don't like them all. People write to me and say, I absolutely didn't like so-and-so, as though, I might have. Of course, I don't like them all either, but in real life, I don't like everybody. I just don't. None of us do we? And that is, again, the exciting and interesting thing about being an author. But I do, whether they're likable or not, I do want to make my characters believable. That is my job. I don't want character tours, I want characters. So I have a very specific exercise that I would pass on to anyone else who's novel writing. And that is, I interview my characters before I start writing my book. After I've written my plot, I sit down and try to get to know my characters just as well as I've just been distracted because I've seen the word abseil, and I remembered somebody else has reminded me. That's what I meant. I did when I came down a very tall building. I didn't just jump randomly because that would be stupid. I abseiled down the building. Anyway, moving on. Back to characters. So I interview them, and obviously I want to know with a character when I start a book, I want to know their gender and their age, and perhaps how many children they have and how many siblings they have, and are the parents still alive, and are they in a relationship, and that's all sort of standard bread and butter stuff. But after that, I also want to know, if I'm writing, say, Lexi, does Lexi have a fat wardrobe and a thin wardrobe? Does Lexi remember her first kiss? What's the moment she's most ashamed of? What's the moment she's most proud of? Does she have a favourite child? These are things lurking in Lexi's psyche that may or may not make it to the page. I'd want to know what her birth sign is. I'd want to know what her first job was. When did she learn to ride a bike? I know these sound crazy, but I have a list of sort of 50-ish questions for my main characters that I always ask them. And sometimes I change them around sometimes, but I'm pretty used to these particular questions now. And it makes me really examine who I'm trying to create. And those things will not all turn up on the page, because if I wrote every single book and told you things like what my character's first kiss was, and whether they had a bike or not, and when they learned to swim, you would be very bored, and I would not be here talking to you. But what it does do is give me a confidence that I know my character inside out. So when she ends up doing something or reacting to someone, I know exactly how she will react and how she will respond to that person. So yeah, that's my top tip. And I teach classes about how to get novels written and how to finish them and all that sort of thing. And that is one of my top tips that I spend quite some time on in my classes, because I think it's really important. So yeah, you can just have that. That's just for you. Um, Other advice to budding writers, it says, how do I develop a plot that stays one step ahead of the reader? Well, it's exhausting because my readers are really clever, and I know you love guessing the books and the twists. And sometimes when someone reviews a book and they'll say, "Oh, you'll get all the twists except for the final one," I think, no, don't say that, because everybody will then be waiting for that final twist and looking for it, and it sort of changes the experience of reading. But I also know it's a huge compliment and it's part of the excitement of the book. I don't do twists that are kind of like, "Ooh, that flipped it on its head," kind of twist. I do reveals that at the end of the novel you might not have seen it coming, but when you look back you'll say, "Oh yes, of course, that led to that, that led to that, that led to that," and it should make perfect sense to you. It takes a lot of work and a lot of plotting, and quite often throwing out many drafts. I have been known twice to throw out my books at 50,000 words, and to give you a sense of that, my novels are normally about 110, 115,000 words long. So throwing books out at 50,000 words, it is quite extreme editing, I think we'll all agree. And one time I threw a book out at 80,000 words. This book I literally threw out at 50,000 words and again at 80,000 words, because the viewpoint is so tricky, because there are lots of secrets and everybody knows something that somebody else doesn't, and I want the reader to know some of it but not all of it, and I want you to trust certain people, and so their viewpoint has to be solid but others maybe not so much. And so yeah, it's quite a lot of work, but clearly worth it. And yeah, and all I can say is put the hours in before you start. I always say pen to paper, as if anyone writes pen to paper anymore. Put the hours in before you start writing, before you sit in front of your computer. Put the hours in of plotting, and I think you will find it saves you some time down the line. However, if you find down the line you still need to re-examine, that's okay. If you need to throw things out, that's okay. It happens to the best of us. Okay, and I think we probably have time for one more question. And that final one is a little bit sort of covered it off really, to plan or not to plan, but I will add something. I've mentioned there that I do plan and I do plot, because books that are thrillers, I think, are dependent on the plot, probably more than maybe more than a character-driven book. A character-driven book you can explore and you might not plan as much. You might let the character unfurl in front of you, and as you might go along and with the book and with the character, and allow him or her to expand and unfurl in front of you, and that's fine and that's brilliant, and there's no right or wrong way. But for me, when I'm writing thrillers or domestic noirs, I very much like to know where the book is going, because I have genuinely always believed each word works harder if you do know where it's going, and the end will be more convincing and more satisfying. There's nothing more frustrating if you're reading a book and then suddenly, you know, some poverty-stricken character finds that they had a trust fund hidden under the floorboards and they were rich all the time, because you think, no, that doesn't happen. You need a believable but surprising ending in domestic noirs and in thrillers, I believe. And the plotting adds to the suspense. And that, my lovely friends, I think brings us sort of to the end of the evening. I'm really touched that you spend your time with me in this way, and I am seeing lots of your messages, and I will, after we say goodbye, I will read all the messages properly and carefully. But it really means a lot to me that you do come along and you share your time, and I hope you get something from it. I am very available. You can find me on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and indeed on my website, and even by email, very simple email, adele@adeleparks.com. All of those social media channels and my emails are only read by me. I do not have a PA reading them or responding to them or making comments. I probably should have, because then they wouldn't make as many typos as I do. But anyway, it's me. And so I hope that you believe when you read one of my books, or indeed one of anybody's books, that you're entering into a private dialogue, not necessarily between me and you, but certainly between you and the words on that page, because I know each one of you, it'd be something slightly different, because each one of you will bring your own experiences to each book. But if you want to talk about that private dialogue to me, then I'm always delighted to hear from you. And I really appreciate you coming tonight. And I know the indies really appreciate you supporting them. And as we edge out of lockdown, if you can get back into your indies, please do. And if you if you can support them by buying online, please do, because I think we all just know bookshops are just a magical place to be, and I don't know where we'd be without them. So I'm going to try and do a quick screen grab. You kind of were all in that moment of history. And thank you very much for just the most lovely evening. And yeah, come get that glass of wine. Bye.